Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Gulsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science. All right, so today we have Dr. Mark McConnell here, who's a professor working on upland game birds at Mississippi State University, and one of the researchers leading some of the ongoing turkey work that you've already heard about, and also have worked quite a bit with several species of galliforms. I guess you've probably done more work on quail than any other species, as far as I remember, Mark. But I know you've been leading some research on turkeys, and you've also talked and studied quite a bit about density dependence, and that's really what we wanted to talk to today. So we really appreciate you coming on the show to talk about that.
No, happy to do it. Yeah, the galliforms are generally the chicken-like birds are a great species to study the topic of density dependence, and there's just a ton of literature around the world on them because of their kind of unique life history. So they're a great critter to talk about this topic with.
Yeah, well, I know that we've kind of mentioned to you how we got here to this topic, and we've had quite a few people on here to talk about different aspects of turkey biology and management efforts, and a lot of those things, especially when you're looking at restocking efforts and looking at the progressions of turkey populations, that really made Will and I both took a step back and thought about that, and it's like, man, some of these things sort of look like what we would expect from a density-dependent mechanism operating. So I was curious, could you kind of walk us through, from a layman's terms, I guess, what is density dependence, what we need to know about it, and then maybe we can move forward from there with some of your work.
Yeah, sure. So density dependence generally, it's a fundamental concept in population ecology. It's simply, there's a couple of different ways to think about it, but the straightforward way is that it's actually a negative relationship between the population growth rate, which is the change in population from one year to the next. We call that lambda, the population growth rate and population density. So when population density goes up, the population growth rate decreases. And that's at its core, that's essentially density dependence. But I like the term you talked about mechanisms. There's lots of mechanisms that can influence density dependence, because density itself is just a number. It's just two numbers that relate to each other in a predictable fashion. What's causing that, what's kind of manifesting that relationship is quite interesting. And there's lots of structures of density dependence. It can decline linearly with population density, and the curves can be all kinds of different ways, and the speed of which it does, and then the strength of it, right? So it can be really, really strong, like a really steep relationship, or it can be really, really subtle. And over the years, density dependence, it was just assumed to be this, like, everyone's like, yeah, that's what it is, and it's always the same. And most early harvest models, when we were getting into harvest theory, as a wildlife profession was determining how we do sustainable yield, we made a lot of assumptions about density dependence, that it's there, it's linear, and it's very simple. But we really didn't have the data to back a lot of that up, and it's probably more nuanced than that. And we really didn't consider what we call density independent factors, things like weather and climate and things that aren't related to density. And it turns out they have a lot of impacts, not only on population growth, but they can actually influence the strength of density dependence as well. And there's just been an abundance of literature across all kinds of animals across the world that have looked into that. So at its core, it's just that populations can't grow indefinitely. They can't always be increasing. At some point, something becomes limiting, and density gets to a point where the growth rate ends up declining. And that's at its core is density dependence. And we've seen that in just innumerable wildlife. And the species we haven't seen it in is usually, if you dig into it, it's because we haven't looked for it. And And turkey, in the turkey world, it's actually an interesting history that we can get into now or later, where it's kind of unlike a lot of other traditionally harvested species and how we kind of approached that question over time.
That's really interesting. So I guess it sounds like you were laying it out in a way that I commonly think of it. It's like that's a principle.
Yes,
So it's
is a fundamental principle.
as much as Will would love there to be an unlimited number of turkeys, that literally just cannot happen. So
It cannot.
at some point, there would be a limitation of space, if nothing else.
Yeah.
Some resource or some factor, limits the population that you would expect some sort of relationship with lambda, which we spent some time on with one of our previous episodes. So I think the audience probably has a pretty good handle on what that means. And then at some point, density has to be influencing lambda in some sort of relationship. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. And what you think about, what's the fundamental core of most wildlife management, especially for game species, right? Is we're trying to find out what that limiting factor is and kind of make it unlimiting, so we can try to increase populations more, either for harvest or sometimes just for restoration techniques. And the methodologies can vary by species and where you're at in the world or where you're at in the country. But at the end of the day, wildlife management is trying to augment that relationship, so we make limiting things unlimited. So if nesting habitat is limited, we try to create more nesting habitat. And the idea, a lot of people seem to think that we can just do that and there's never a downside to it. But eventually, one thing's going to become limited. There's no population can increase forever, right? It's just, it's never been done. We have seen, and we've, like you said, with the turkey restoration, populations increasing exponentially quite rapidly, often after restoration in a very habitable environment. But of course, that something happens eventually where that stops. So a lot of times in wildlife management, we kind of do things like, if the food's unlimited, we may add food, right? And we add food, and we can actually increase the population growth rate. But at some point, there's still going to be a consequence. And one of the best examples I can give that is with Bob Whites, which I've spent most of my career working on, and Bill Palmer, who's the head of the research program at Tall Timbers, who's done just amazing research over the years with quail. He presented this at the last National Quail Symposium, where they have some properties where there's just insanely high quail densities, like supplemental feeding, trapping predators, just all these different kind of what we call habitat plus practices, these things that are addition to habitat.
It's like an intensive quail management model.
It's just as intensive as it comes, and there's quail everywhere, right?
Yeah, I mean,
like you literally can't figure out anything to put into it. You've already done everything.
I mean, they've been pushing some of those quail populations beyond densities that we ever have recorded in history, right?
Oh, it's insane. Yeah, it's insane. And so when I I did my dissertation with their, they had a 42-year data set that Bill Palmer gave me for my dissertation. And I was just fascinated with just density dependence in general. But in quail, we knew it was there, but we didn't really have a good number on it. We didn't understand the strength of the relationship. And most of the density dependent work had been done by Fred Guthrie out in Oklahoma, maybe 20 years before that. So we really didn't have a southeastern perspective. So Bill just presented this, and I think it's a paper in the Quail Symposium, but it was fascinating. What they showed was, on these properties that had insanely high densities, there was a cost, right? Like, you can have these high densities, you don't have them forever, but quail populations tend to ebb and flow. On years where they were getting like 5 or plus birds per acre, which is just an insanely high density.
5 birds per acre. That's what they're carrying into the fall.
That's the fall population. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. There are places out there where they're pointing coveys like every 7 minutes. It's just insane in some years.
I don't know what that's like.
Yeah, no, me either. I quail hunt on public land in the deep south. I definitely don't know what that is. But so what's fascinating was, what they showed was the following year, Bill showed that about half the hens didn't nest, right? So typically about 80% of the hens at least attempt one nest. The following year was about 0.46, I can't remember what the exact number was, of the hens nested that they had radio. And they radio a lot of birds. So essentially, you almost cut the nesting attempts in half, simply following a year of incredibly high density. Now, granted, not all those birds make it into the breeding season, but a fair, typically 50% overwinter survival. That's still a lot of birds.
Yeah.
But on properties where you didn't have as high densities, you definitely saw more typical nesting percentages or nesting attempts.
What is normal?
About 80%. Yeah.
Okay. So it went from 80 to 50, you said.
Yeah, 4.6 or point something like that.
Yeah,
So
okay.
almost a halving, but not quite. That's still significant, right? But here's what happened: those birds that did nest, they had good success, and the population was high the next year, but not nearly as high. And then it kind of does this ebb and y'all can't see my hand, kind of does this ebb and flow thing as you would expect. But that begs the question. So that's density dependence, right? There's just no other explanation for that. The density got high, and there was some counter in a reproductive. Usually, it's reproduction or survival. Something has to give, or
Well,
both.
yeah,
And
and the other thing that I just want to add real quick, this is in that data is from a place where you've tried to remove all limitations, right?
yes, yes,
So you
as
you're
much as
putting
possible.
you, as much food as you can get on the landscape. It's also is ideal in structure and composition and juxtaposition of vegetation structure and all those things. As ideal as you know to make it, you're intensively persecuting predators to the extent I've never seen implemented everywhere, but anywhere else. But I have heard that some places in Europe may rival it.
Yeah,
Uh,
definitely in Europe, everything goes there, hawks and everything.
yeah, so that's kind of crazy to me because you've literally done all the things that you can do in that high production and high input system, and you still have something that's causing them to do that. So
Yeah,
that
and it's not like the population declines to a low level. It has to find a way there. So the question I was getting at is you have to ask yourself what's limiting at that point. Is it quality nesting habitat? Is it there's only so many places quail can nest? What is it for 40 or whatever percent of that is reduction of those birds to go, you know what? I'm not nesting. Are they not in reproductive condition? We don't know, right?
That's immediately where my mind goes
Yeah.
is, if you cut, nesting attempt in half, there maybe those females weren't in adequate body condition to even attempt.
Yeah. So then
well,
then
that's
somebody
actually
might say,
different.
they're
Sorry.
supplementally fed, so they are. But then what happens if they do about 2 bushels per acre out there every 2 weeks, I think? Then it becomes, what if you did 10, right? So wildlife management from a game standpoint is we're trying to affect that density dependent relationship so we can have more birds to harvest so that next year, the population is going to keep doing this. It doesn't mean the population, the growth rate declined, but it didn't decline, drastically. It just declined. And that decline itself is evidence that there's a density dependent mechanism affecting that growth rate. And that's expected. It's really cool. And like you were saying, Marcus, it's really even cooler in an environment where you can't manage more intensively, I don't think, than they do in that region. They do a
Yeah.
tremendous job of it, but it's still going to occur. And my dissertation showed the same thing. I had 42 years of data from tall timbers where they're doing great stuff. And we still showed that, right after a huge bump year, we had a declining growth rate. And then the next year it was a positive growth rate. And on average, the growth rate over 42 years was literally like 1.02. So it was stable, right? A one lambda of one is stable. There were years of growth and years of decline, but overall it was a stable population, which is what you want.
Mhm.
And so even in a stable population, density dependence occurs. It also occurs in unstable populations, and that's where it gets tricky because, especially with the turkey debate right now, is what is the status of a turkey population that you're studying? Which that's a whole, maybe you've already talked about that. Turkeys aren't necessarily easy to. We don't have a really good way to count them, which is a huge problem that we're all trying to figure out ways around. And what is the ramifications of those relationships when a population's in decline, or if a population's not in decline? What does it matter? And the whole point of what I study, I knew tall timbers wasn't in decline, right? We've seen what they do, but I thought it'd be a great place to study how Galliform populations are what density dependence means in those populations. And what we found was it was a combination. Density dependence was the regulatory factor, right? And regulation means you're constantly returning a feedback loop, right, on that growth rate. Something's making it come back. But we found that density independent factors, weather, actually had an important relationship too. It wasn't as strong as density dependence, but it was definitely a factor. And I think what we found was the rainfall. I think I should really know this, but I'm assuming my
It's
other
been a
doctor
while.
doesn't know it. Rainfall between January and April, which is a really limiting time for quail. Most of the food's natural cover's gone. You've gone through the bottleneck of the winter. It's tough
Mhm.
weather. Predators are hawks are migrating. It's all kinds of things being thrown at them. But weather during that period also had a pretty interesting impact on the growth rate. And we thought that was really informative because it it meant we can't just focus on density, right? Density is important. We need to monitor it. We need to know that strength of that relationship, but the weather can have an important impact too. And we've seen that across just dozens of taxa that have studied this. In fact, used to, all you saw was density dependence in the titles. In the last 15 years, most of what you see is concomitant effects of density and density independent factors on species X, right? It's kind of become a more holistic question where we know now that we can't think of it as binary. It's not just density independent or just density dependent, right? There was a whole slew of research in the 50s that indicated that density independence was the most important thing. And these guys named Andrew and Birch published this book in, I think, 1954 that really dug into that. And it kind of threw a wrench into the density dependent ecologists around the world. And they fought about it. There's all these debate papers where they're just going back and forth at each other, response to this, response to that. And then about the late 90s, early 2000s, it seems like everyone kind of planned out. I was like, you know what? Both these things are happening, and it's probably worth it to study both of them to really understand how populations move over time. And that's kind of where most people have landed. But I'll just go real quick. In the turkey world, it was a little bit different. If you look at some of the early population dynamics research, I think it's the Van Gilder monograph, which I'm sure you both read, one of the most cited turkey papers in the world. In that manuscript, they assume density independence. They assume that there's not a density dependent relationship, right? They say it. I can't remember which page it's on, but that's the assumption of that paper. And they cite at the time. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to. How could that be a base assumption? Like, what is that? Why is that being made?
So here's what they said. They said in several papers, Van Hilder's paper in the late 90s showed this too. They all say the same thing. I'm paraphrasing them all here, but they all kind of say, no evidence yet has been presented to demonstrate density dependence, blah, 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 blah. Okay, there hadn't been. I've scoured the literature, right? Or at least nothing published in the peer-reviewed literature. But we also weren't asking that question quite directly back then. Density dependence is really hard to document. Most of the research says you need at least 30-year time series to actually estimate it, okay? All right, so we already established we don't know how to count turkeys very well. So there are no 30-year data sets on abundance. Now we have long-term data on maybe poults per hen and certain indices we have, but most researchers agree you need at least a 30-year data set to even be able to quantify density dependence. There's several papers in the 90s that kind of settled on that number. So there wasn't that in the 90s for turkeys. When Van Gilder's paper was published, no one had that kind of data. And maybe they were asking that. I haven't seen it, but it wasn't something that had been quantified. And beyond that, Marcus, I don't know what led to their assumption. They kind of assumed that up to 10%, I think it was 10% harvest, would kind of have no impact, which may be the case, density dependence or not. I don't know. But that's kind of how turkey research kind of started when when the radios came out, people started doing these big data set, these big telemetry studies. That was the assumption in Van Gilder's paper. And that's kind of predicated through. It wasn't until not very long ago we got kind of the first peer-reviewed quantified density dependent estimates, and that was McGee's papers. He had two papers in, I think, JWM in his dissertation, and he had 11 states of data in some of that research. And they not only did they quantify, they used all kinds of really cool Ricker models and theta logistic models and really cool stuff. But what they found was, yeah, it's density dependent, and it's actually nonlinear, which means that it's not just this simple relationship that as density increases, lambda decreases proportionally, right? It was actually a nonlinear curve, which even more emphasizes the importance of understanding this from a population harvest standpoint, because we really need to know the shape of that curve to understand how our harvest rates actually impact populations. And that's some of the best research that's come out. There was some other research, Bobby Bond's research, and was published several years ago. He was one of the first ones to look at kind of pulse per hen, the first one I've seen, to look at pulse per hen and like BBS and kind of relate the breeding bird survey data. Because there was a paper published in 2015 or 16 by Mike Byrne and Mike Chamberlain and Brett Collier. There may have been one other person on that author
I think
list.
that was all. Yeah.
That was it. But Mike Byrne led that, and and Mike, they all published really cool stuff. They showed that. Bobby Bond showed that in a smaller journal several years earlier. He showed that the indexes they had correlated fairly well with the breeding bird survey to some degree, and he showed that the pulse per hen, when it was going down, the breeding bird survey was increasing to some degree, right? And that's been replicated now with the Byrne 2015 or 16 paper that showed that across 14 states. It was some
Yeah, a lot of
incredibly
them.
robust
There's a
analysis.
lot of them.
Yeah. So I agree. So now we're kind of realize we have kind of McGee's papers kind of implicated that we needed the density dependence was happening in turkeys. It's nonlinear. It's fascinating ecologically, but we haven't seen that kind of be shifted into harvest models now as much as maybe we some other galliforms have, because we've kind of had those numbers beforehand. So in the turkey world, it's fairly novel.
Well, just one question for me that you know uh, that I immediately arrive as: why do we have that data on, let's say, quail or another game bird, but not on turkeys? Like, what is
Man,
there something? Is there something about the species, like their biology, that's limiting it, or has it just been interest by researchers or the perceived need, or do you know, or
I
do you have an
don't
idea
know.
about that?
I think, like I said, I'm very new to the turkey specific world. I've only been really digging into that literature since I guess 2019. There's
Mm-hmm.
two things that we seem to have not figured out with turkeys that most other people figured out better. One was just how to count them with any precision. Right now, birds in general are hard to count.
Mm-hmm.
Birds with kind of unique calling activity like turkeys, maybe that makes it a little more complicated. Um, but like even with bobwhites, which we've been counting forever, I mean, we don't. It's still hard to get precise estimates, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
there's so much variability in calling over time. Um, but also, it's just one of those things where there's a ton of examples in wildlife management where we've we've kind of made an assumption and it seemed to work, and we just rode with it, and we never went back and asked, wait, why didn't
Mm-hmm.
we do this before? And time just went on, and we spent a lot of time in turkeys asking other questions.
Mm-hmm.
We've really examined nest site selection, reproductive ecology, like we've survival estimates. We've got tons and tons of reports of that. Um, but yeah, we probably weren't asking some of those questions that we had all just kind of taken for granted. I mean, the bobwhite people have done this too. Deer people, everyone does it. We kind of
Mm-hmm.
take certain fundamentals of science for granted, and then somebody goes, "Oh wait," and then we go back and it starts the
Hmm.
whole debate and the question again. Which it depends on where you're at in your career when that happens, if it's a good thing or a bad thing, right?
Well, I think one thing is sort of, we've said it several times, and I bring it up every time I hear about it, but it kind of highlights one of the reasons it's important to have a bunch of people working on species,
Yeah,
because
I
you
agree.
are really knowledgeable and interested in density dependence. And I think it's interesting, but I'm not knowledgeable, and it's probably not going to be a
Hmm.
major thrust of my research program on turkeys.
Well, I think y'all
So,
have probably realized as much as I have at this point in our careers, it's kind of hard to start a whole new topic in your research program.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
It's
that's the
enough to.
yeah, and that's the point I'm trying to make, is we need a bunch of people that are interested in all these different aspects, or we're going to not address one that's not interesting to us. And
Well,
that's one that
and
I would
Well,
definitely neglect because of lack of experience and know-how, and it doesn't immediately jump out as the thing that I need to know about turkeys.
sure.
Just from my own personal interest, and we all have those things about about our program that we really like, or we really find fascinating, that we put all our our effort into.
Yeah.
yeah, and I mean, it was only recently that there was enough money that people were interested in investing in turkey research for there to be a diversity of people working in that field. Because,
Mm-hmm.
as we've just discussed, up until usually around early 2000s for most places, populations were still in that exponential growth phase.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And two things on that. So, Will, that's an excellent point. And I got a little flack with my density dependent research with tall timbers, because they were like, well, yeah, it's tall timbers, though. How realistic is that? It's a stable population, and quail are generally declining everywhere. And I was like, my God, if we don't study the population dynamics while they're stable, how will we ever know what to do when they're
Mm-hmm.
declining, right? So, you know, we should have been asking that question with quail a long time ago, and we weren't. Same with turkeys. I wish we had more than just, when did McGee's paper come out? 2008, 2007. I wish we had more time where we've been thinking about this. But you're right. We kind of took advantage of the fact, hey, turkeys are doing fine. But that would have been
Mm-hmm.
a good time to research those questions, so we would actually maybe we'd be a little more prepared for these debates uh,
Mm-hmm.
regarding this stuff. And then, Marcus, you were talking about the multiple people working on stuff. In a standard graduate student course, like a research methods type course, most people read T.C. Chamberlain's paper that talks about multiple working hypotheses. And what he cautioned, not to nerd out on your listeners, but what he cautions is only having one hypothesis to test, because when you only have one, it takes like a childlike, it's like your child, right? And you're going to protect it at all costs. But when you have multiple working hypotheses, you're less attached to any one individual hypothesis. So as hypotheses get dropped through the falsification, through the scientific method, whatever's left standing, you should be good. And I think that's where we need to go with this stuff going on with turkeys now. We need to have multiple people going about this, collaborating or not, hopefully collaborating. So we're testing multiple hypotheses so that we can hopefully see which hypothesis is standing at the end of the day. And then as a collective body of concerned turkey ecologists and enthusiasts, we say, okay, we've got some evidence. Let's take the next step in this research question and figure out what this means and what we do about it, right? And hopefully that's the approach everyone takes. But I agree, more and more people need to be working on this question. The more the merrier. And to Will's point, definitely now as there seems to be funding to do that. There's multiple sources of funding now. The states are fired up about it. So it's a good time.
Well, one of the big things about this, and we wanted to give you an opportunity, and maybe we'll need to do that in a different episode if it's warranted. But one of the things that Will and I were doing with this podcast is trying to give people, wherever you're at, whatever state you're in, what is going on in your state on turkeys? Like, what's the current research that's going on right now? And when we sat down and really started trying to work out what that would look like, it's like, wow, we have almost, I don't even know how many states covered. It's a lot.
Yeah.
Way more than I was expecting when I was just kind of thinking through that idea at first.
Yeah.
We have,
there's gonna be abundance of turkey papers coming out over the next decade, and good.
I was excited about it. I really view it as we're all in this together. We're trying to figure out the best way to conserve the resource, and I think of it much less as competition, which that just not a good way to look at it. Like, we're trying to do this together.
Yes,
we all care about turkeys. So
I think
that's phenomenal.
I want to answer turkey questions that help my state, or any state for that matter, but obviously Mississippi, since that's who's funding my turkey research, most of it right now. We've got some money from the Turkeys for Tomorrow and the Turkey Federation, and very grateful for that. But most of my money right now on that topic is coming from the state agency. So I want to help them, give them the information they need to make an informed decision. So we were dealing with I think we're the only state left in the Southeast, maybe, that that hasn't pushed their season dates back.
Yeah, we haven't either.
Oh, y'all haven't? Okay.
Only two, right, I think.
Yeah, because we have a map and it shows like where you can hunt, and it's like us and a certain part of the year. It's like just y'all and us. And like I said, we work really closely with Adam Butler and our state, a lot of our state people, but he's the turkey guy. And when he and I were first talking about this, the question, that he and I were discussing, I said, look, y'all are going to make it, the commission's going to make a decision, as commissions do, and hopefully it's science-based and that thing. I said, but right now, my point was, I didn't think we had enough science to make an informed decision in Mississippi. And I said, if you could give us the time, and I've spoken with, the commissioner, one of the commissioners, if you could just give us the time to help inform this question, right? Let us get a little bit of information. We'll present it to y'all. It's y'all's decision ultimately. But we wanted, all wildlife management or wildlife science really is, guys, in my opinion, is reducing uncertainty, right? Finding ways to reduce uncertainty in decision making. And right now, I think there's a lot of uncertainty in that decision, and we're just trying to reduce that uncertainty. So if they have to make a decision, if there's a public pressure to do so, they can make one that is, rooted in science as much as we can hope it can be. But it's a tough thing.
Yeah, and to build on that, Mark, and to kind of circle back and tie in one of the points that you made earlier at the same time. And this is something that maybe some of our listeners are getting tired of hearing me saying, but I think the importance of the multiple working hypotheses is also that there's probably some hypotheses that are true in certain places and false in others.
Oh yeah.
And the relative importance of each of these mechanisms that are affecting turkey populations likely has some geographical variation.
Yeah.
Right. And so, we take these first cuts at understanding populations, and then you start to increase the resolution of the data down further and further over time so that we understand, how to manage population A through Z. Right.
Yeah. 100%.
And,
Yeah. And that, oh, I'm sorry, Marcus, were you about to say something?
well, I was just going to add one tidbit to it that, we also we have this tendency to try to simplify things, and we kind of assume that they are
Yeah.
mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
And it's, what you were talking about earlier, that's not only unlikely, it's almost not a possibility.
Yeah.
Even.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah. Well, and
so,
to your point, the true in one spot, not the other. Nothing's a better poster child for that point than density dependence and density independence. So
Mm-hmm.
you take like Bob Whites, for example. Uh, they're in the western part of their range, like in Texas and Oklahoma, they are largely the evidence largely supports they're more driven by density independent factors
Mm-hmm.
because there's so many more different climatic extreme or weather extremes, right?
mhm.
So rainfall is generally, like in Texas, that's a density independent factor that has a disproportionately larger impact on population growth than, say, density dependent does. That's not to say density dependence doesn't exist and is not operating. It's just often not the driving factor for population growth.
Mhm.
Now, if you look at Texas, like, for example, we'll talk about a boom and a bust, like they've got years where there's so many quail, it's just insane. You will see density dependence manifest in those years more. But when you look over long time series, it's typically more driven by density independent factors, and both things are happening, right? It doesn't mean
Mm-hmm.
one is all we care about and the other one doesn't matter. It means that in that landscape, it's more density independent has a larger impact probably than density dependence over long time series, right? Whereas that might not be the case in certain other parts of the country. And with turkeys, right? Any species that you're in more extreme environments, you're going to probably have a disproportionate influence from density independent factors, just as an ecological principle. But it doesn't mean density dependence isn't operating. It just means more times than not, the population growth may be more impacted by a weather event. And that's good to know, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
that's good for us to study so we know how to, because the things I was thinking with my dissertation when I was talking to Bill Palmer at the beginning of it, I was like, if we find this weather pattern has this impact, right, and we know how that impacts the population, could we, as we document a weather event like that or a weather pattern, could Bill then use that to say, hey guys, the weather during this part of the year was whatever, it's probably going to manifest in a negative way. Let's back off our harvest this year, right? That was kind of
Mm-hmm.
the logical work through I had. They really never had to do that because tall timbers, their harvest is really conservative, to their credit. They have a good time, but I think on average they're maybe shooting 8% of the population, which is, not much at all. But that was kind of the end goal I had. But it would be the same with any species, right? If we know the impact of a density independent mechanism, that would help us prepare. All right. Or it may not affect how we can manage, it may, but at most it can help us prepare for setting harvest regulations, right? Like if
Mhm.
Texas, if we're at the beginning of what, the weather folks predicts going to be a 5-year drought, that's pretty good information to know if you want to adjust your harvest as a result,
Mm-hmm.
because you're not going to have as much production, right?
Mhm.
That's the kind of benefit we have from studying density dependence and density independence in any harvested population.
Well, Mark, one thing it's kind of circling back to some things you said earlier, but it's been festering with me, and I'm thinking through this. You were talking about the quail example with that data that's really cool long term data, and you're super familiar with it, obviously. When you had that dramatic reduction in hen nesting, could that be? I mean, something related to density presumably is causing that. Could that be related to their social behavior? Like, I don't
Yeah.
know what, like, you'll have to forgive my ignorance, but I'm not sure about how the nesting works in terms of the hens relative to one another.
Yeah. Well, so good. That's an excellent question. We have no idea what the mechanism there. We don't know if it's nesting habitat is. Craig Harper's going to kill me for saying nesting habitat. We don't know if nesting cover is limiting.
We'll have to
God,
talk to him about that.
if Craig's listening, I'll pay for that. I corrected it, Craig. But if it's nesting cover that's limiting, or if it's like Will was talking about, if it's physiological condition, but that would lead to, okay, what causes that, right?
Yeah.
Something's limiting. Is it food? That's an
Mhm.
Well, and it's
indication.
hard to fathom in that circumstance, given they're
It
pouring as much
really
of us.
is. It really is. And then to the social component, it could be that because of increased competition for nesting, perhaps there's so many quail that maybe they're stressing each other out. And that would be more of a physiological issue as well. We really don't know. I'd have to go back and pull up the paper. I think Bill said the nest success, I want to say, was fairly good. And quail are really good about compensation. James Martin published a really cool paper that kind of looked at that. They when survival is really low for whatever reason, they tend to have more fecundity, and when survival is really high, they tend to be less fecund. So they have the ability to compensate, maybe not always fully. But I don't know what the issue is. It's crazy that as much as we've studied that bird, we don't know why that is, and I think that's because the quail community, we're all as guilty as anybody. Well, the turkey people have done this, the quail people, the deer people, everyone's we fall into these kind of research questions that we can get funded, and it's often cool stuff. It's really the public likes to hear about it, and we do a bunch of collar and faller studies where we just tag stuff and see what happens, and we report the same metrics, and that's a great way to build a resume. It's a great way to build up population parameters that we are now using to build population models. But with quail and turkeys too, I guess we spent a couple of decades not asking these more challenging questions that may actually have moved the needle a little bit. But I don't mean to be on a soapbox, because I sure as hell haven't done it any more than anybody. It's hard to ask those questions, right? The challenge with density dependence is not only do you need if you don't have a long-term study, like long-term abundance data, you've pretty much got to go to a manipulative approach. And manipulative experiments at the scale of which turkeys operate to study density dependence, that's hard to do. That's very expensive. It's very hard to pull off, and it makes those questions a little more elusive to us, because it takes a lot to really if you don't have the long-term data, you've got to perform an experiment and see if you can invoke it. And that's tough. I mean, it's
and even then with that experimental design, you still may not get at the underlying mechanism. I mean, you may get at some proximate causes, but maybe not the ultimate one.
Mechanisms are very hard for wildlife ecologists to get to.
Yeah. So I spend a lot of my time trying to figure out how to isolate mechanisms. I'll say that.
So that's, I think, a great overview and explanation of density dependence, and pulling from some of the literature on species that we understand a little bit more about that on. So given kind of all that, Mark, I mean, what do you think is the relative weight of evidence that some of what we're seeing right now with turkey populations in certain areas is being driven by density dependence?
Yeah, I think it's fairly strong. I think, I don't know if this is when we first started recording or before, but y'all were talking about the kind of the data we're seeing, and the curves look like things you see in textbooks. Yeah, I mean, we restocked turkeys. They did really, really, really well, and then they started to do less well. And I've looked at a lot of the states that have reported their kind of. So this is the thing: most states are reporting harvest data, right? And some of them are qualifying that one with effort. Most of them are or not. And there's some questions in the literature about if that's really necessary or not. But most of the states show, lots and lots of really good harvests, which indicated populations were good. And then it's been a decline. Some, as I've seen about 14 states worth of data in the Southeast. Some are showing at regional levels, not state levels for the most part, but at regional level, they're showing some declines. But a lot of the states over the last 15 years are showing relatively, what I would consider relatively stable harvest numbers, right? And at a state level, in some regions it's different, some it's higher. And so I agree. When I look at that, I think, okay, and this brings up another concept in ecology or population ecology, which is carrying capacity, which again is something I think a lot of people misunderstand. And it's a term that gets used, in my opinion, way too much, probably erroneously in our profession. But the carrying capacity, one, is a very hard thing to measure. I would argue no one in the game bird world has ever effectively really knows what carrying capacity is. But it's also this assumption, a lot of people assume carrying capacity is static over time. Carrying capacity changes yearly, probably seasonally, right? We just, it's so all over the place. But let's assume when you see those peaks in the late 90s, kind of early stuff when a lot of people were doing really good, most of the restoration was done throughout the Southeast, although we had some counties in Mississippi we were still stocking, I think, in the mid 90s. And you're looking at that, and they're like, okay, carrying capacity was probably really high because turkeys were still kind of colonizing a lot of those states, and just the populations were expanding. And then it goes down, but now a lot of states seem to be kind of ebbing and flowing around what I would call a very interesting number. Well, it could be that that's just the new operational carrying capacity we're kind of dealing with in these modern landscapes. The landscapes changed a lot. Now I talk to people all the time and say, look, I burn, I thin trees, I do food plots, I do everything. I've got 2 camps on this that I talk to. And he said, I'm still seeing turkeys decline. And what I ask him to do is go to Google Earth and zoom out and look beyond their property. And until what happens beyond their property is not really conducive to turkeys, right? Then I've got guys who are doing that exact same stuff and have more turkeys than they know what to do with. And they're like, I don't know what people are talking about, man. I've got more turkeys than I do this. I'll zoom out and it's like, oh, okay, you got a lot more people actually, lighting a little more fires, for example. I hate to reduce it to just fire, but fire is really good for turkeys, as you guys have well published on. So I think that the evidence is strong that is one hypothesis we need to have in our list to evaluate. And I think that it could be that what we're seeing now is that I don't want to call out any states, but I've got a graph in my head that of a state's harvest data over the last 15 years that was fairly stable, like really stable. And to me, that means, hey, whatever you're doing is okay. Is it going up? No, but you're not declining, at least from that metric.
Yeah.
And to me, that compared to where they were 20 years before that, that shows me that the landscape's changed enough, and this is kind of the new norm that we need to be operating in. And to me, anyone who says carrying capacity, if as a concept, if you accept that carrying capacity is an ecological concept, you accept density dependence.
Yeah.
Because there's no benefit to understanding carrying capacity unless there's a cost of reaching carrying capacity.
Right.
And you see a lot of people talk about we're managing for K. God, don't manage for K. Carrying capacity, you manage for carrying capacity, you don't want to be at carrying capacity. Harvest theory is predicated on that you manage for half of carrying capacity, so you have enough fecundity to have a surplus to harvest, right? So we need to be operating at about half K. And if that's the case, more power to us, right? That's great. But if you believe in carrying capacity and believe that populations, when they reach it, decline because of something, you're describing density dependence with another term, right? So density dependence is there.
So based on some of the stuff that's been published and some of these reports, does it look consistent with what you would expect in a lot of places?
In a lot of places, I would say yes. But then again, I don't want to say that that's definitely the case. I think it should be one of our leading hypotheses.
Well, I think that's if it does, I think Will and I have explicitly said that a lot of places, the data that we have seen does look like, I think I may have even opened with that.
Yeah.
That it to us, but we're both acknowledging that you're the expert on it, not us. So that's why I'm asking you more directly. Does that look consistent?
I think a lot of patterns I've seen in the available turkey data would indicate that is there's support for that hypothesis.
There's it's reasonable that we should pursue more on that.
Yeah, okay. That's why I'm saying I think it's a leading hypothesis we should investigate further. If you take the Burn paper, which I would consider one of the larger scale approaches to that, those graphs, those relationships they show are incredibly strong.
Yeah.
And it's really hard for me to move off of that, because when I saw that paper, I was like, man, this is fascinating.
Yeah.
That we're seeing this across so many states. And it seems kind of counterintuitive. I think a lot of hunters may have some challenges with it because they're not seeing maybe that on the ground. It's hard for them to manifest what we see in data to what they're seeing on the hunting. Some maybe are, but the other challenge to that is, though, so remember with that study, the pulse per hen ratio, and then they had the breeding bird survey, which we use for tons of other birds, right? First time Bobby Mon used it for turkeys in the 90s, but this is kind of the first really more robust approach, I think, on turkeys that's been used that I've seen. But it's still not like the best data we could have for abundance, right? That's the real challenge. I don't think until we really find a good way to estimate turkey abundance with any level of precision, that we're going to be in a jam. And Dana Morin is who's working with me on this turkey stuff. She's done some really cool work looking at like certain population estimates that we often rely on. They estimate an abundance, an index of something, but the precision is often poor enough that we honestly can't detect anything other than like enormous drops in the index. And for turkeys, we need to have a better way to really estimate them, to really get at this question. So there was some study in Tallahassee Wildlife Management Area in Mississippi back in the George Hurst, Bruce Leopold days, Darren Miller and Mike Chamberlain and a bunch of those guys, and they were doing all their graduate work. They did I think it was in Tallahassee, they did like a mark recapture study. They had some banded birds, and they showed pretty good agreement with what they had versus some other indices they had for harvest, for example. It was okay. And I'm not saying harvest is unreliable. But I think the other challenge we face relying on harvest long term is right now you can standardize harvest by effort, right? And most states do that.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look over time and you're using harvest as an index of abundance, you're assuming the effort is constant, right? That's the implicit assumption in that. And that often is a challenging assumption to make. Like in Mississippi right now, we're seeing our numbers do this in one region while harvest is going down. We're actually seeing a divergence where a lot of states
increasing harvest with decreasing effort. Is that what you're saying?
Decreasing harvest with increasing hunter effort.
Mm-hmm.
Well, another thing that I'll add in and let you respond to, where with what you're saying, we also probably assume that the harvest isn't density dependent or that it's linear with.
Yeah.
So in other words, like that it doesn't get easier for a hunter to kill turkeys, or they don't get better at it as you have more turkeys available or something like that.
And look, that's some interesting stuff too. So in the quail world, Fred Guthrie did some great research on this early on. He found that, essentially when quail get really low, it's really hard to fill a bag, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And turkeys may be the same way. So Mike Chamberlain published a really cool paper while he was at LSU with Blake Grisham. Blake Grisham is a professor at Texas Tech in Lubbock. Good friend of mine, brilliant scientist, does a lot of work on lesser prairie chickens now. He was doing, I think, his master's with Mike at the time on Sherburne Wildlife Management Area, and they were shooting the hell out of some gobblers on that WMA. And I want to say it was like I can't remember exactly, maybe like a 35% harvest rate or something like that. And their data indicated, I don't remember how many years of data they had, but it was a robust study. They indicated that they were probably shooting too many birds. Like it was an additive kind of effect. And if most of your listeners are hunters, we have a discussion on additive versus compensatory mortality, but I have a lot of strong opinions.
We have an episode that we brought. We talk about that in more detail.
I have a lot of strong opinions. I don't like how those terms are defined, but maybe that's another thing. But they showed that it was additive based off conventional definitions, but there hasn't been a ton of studies like that. I think Mike did that paper, and you don't see a lot of studies like that.
Mm-hmm.
And we probably need to have a better understanding of what a sustainable harvest rate is, but it's hard to know that unless you're putting a bunch of leg bands on birds and estimating abundance and then seeing how many of those are getting shot. There's research questions we can do. We just haven't historically done as many of them maybe across the range as we need to, because to Will's point earlier, it's not going to be the same everywhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
Populations are going to be at different positions in their trajectory and in different densities, even if they're in the same trajectory. And harvest is going to vary dramatically in terms of effort. And that's a big question to ask. That's very expensive to get at least at a scale that would be probably most meaningful.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that's really made me gravitate towards density dependent mechanisms being, partially responsible for the declines in harvest that we're seeing in some states is that the timeline for those declines is just so consistent across such a broad geographic scale. There's some variance in that. Like you can see that states that restocked later tend to still be stable or increasing, like North Carolina, for example. Yeah. But that just has kept me up at night. It's like, what could the one thing be when you look across the range at which this decline is occurring? You have such different landscapes, different land use types, even different climates, right? So like, what is the one unifying theme that could explain that? And I'm not saying it's the only answer, it's the silver bullet, but it is definitely the one thing that could be acting at such a scale on such a consistent timeline that is at least partially responsible for what we're seeing here.
Yeah. And so like when I think about like what I'm seeing in those graphs, those state reports, it definitely seems that something happened. Most of them, it's around 2002, 2004, right? Something changed, right? I don't know what it was. You start to see a shift.
Was that
And
the year that they were dropping raccoons out of the planes?
no, that was the year the states went and trapped all the turkeys on private land and moved them to the WMAs.
Oh, okay.
That was that. Yeah. But at the same time, DU was heating up ponds, in Missouri to keep the ducks from migrating. That was the big one when I was in high school. This huge CIA level attempt to stop Louisiana duck hunters from shooting mallard. That was the conspiracy theory when I was in high school. And but hell, I bought into it then because I was mad and I was like, what's going on? So something happened. And the where I really see the density dependence, the evidence I think that is suggestive, so take the burn paper, which I thought was fantastic. But the real evidence I see is that the populations, a lot of them, not all, but a lot of them, when they report, they're seeing what I consider very stable harvest numbers now, whereas those harvests would have been considered very low 20 years ago. And I think the landscape has changed enough, probably to the detriment of turkeys across most of their range. And now the carrying capacity is lower. And we're seeing the manifestation of a less favorable landscape, reducing the potential for a population to kind of grow much more beyond what it is. Because on properties where, and even big properties where turkeys are their primary goal, they're not worried about pine goats, they're worried about turkeys. When they're really after turkeys, on the properties that I know, they've got turkeys, right? And I think there's a question we need to ask ourselves is, are we managing, and this is at a scale that benefits turkey populations. Now, and Chamberlain's done a little bit of work on this, and they've got some cool research, him and Brett. But what we really don't know yet is at what scale they respond to. And we don't know that for many birds or animals. We don't know what scale we should be managing on to truly impact turkey populations. We assume it's probably bigger than we think, but we really don't know. Mike's been asking the question for several years now about how big of, Marcus, y'all did some of this with scale of fire, right? But that's just one tool, right? What about timber thinnings? What about all these other parts of the landscape that turkeys have to use? How big is it? Is it a 5,000 acre landscape? Is it 10?
Yeah, and then whatever scale that's set at, what are the relative proportions that need to be in these seasonal use cover types for turkeys? For example, I'm sure you guys both run into this all the time the same way I do. It's like you're talking to a landowner and they ask you, well, what proportion of my property does need to be in brooding and nesting habitat? It's like, I don't know, 25, 30%.
As much as you can manage.
Yeah, that's kind of the number that I generally throw out there, but as long as it's well distributed. But we don't have data that shows that.
I can be very confident that it's more than zero. Which is often with brooding, especially, it's often at zero or near zero.
And it's not 100 because we still need roost sites and acorns.
Exactly.
And that's the big question, right? That's another question. I think we've identified 5 research questions already that are very challenging to answer, very expensive, but they're probably important because that would be helpful. Take like WMAs, for example. And WMAs across states, or some states manage a little more turkey friendly maybe than others, and it probably varies within the state and where the WMA is and all that kind of stuff. And I'm a big fan of the states and the efforts they make, but there are some WMAs that turkeys, historically have been very abundant on that are not, and it doesn't take a lot of driving through to understand why that is. You can drive 10 minutes on certain WMAs and go, all right, I can see why there's less turkeys here, right? And it's usually because of lack of timber thinning or burning or often both. You guys have both done a lot in that sphere, and those are the things we really need to do a lot of, especially in bottomland systems, right? I know bottomland systems that should hold way more turkeys than the evidence suggests they do, but there's not a lot of timber thinning in those, and there's a lot of political pressure to not cut some hardwood trees now in some areas of the world, but so there's challenges associated with managing it at meaningful scales. And I don't mean to make it seem like it's terribly easy, but it can be difficult, especially for states.
Yeah. So if density dependence is, at least partially responsible for some of what we're seeing with turkeys right now, what would you propose? I know we don't have data on this, but the mechanism behind that would be.
Ooh, yeah. Well, it seems to me that the evidence,
and maybe just extrapolate, from the quail world.
Yeah. So it seems to me right now the evidence of the poults per hen declining is, most states have declined on that. The burn paper showed that most states have shown that to varying slopes, right? Some have declined dramatically. Some seem to be a little stable. Mississippi this year, we just reported the highest poults per hen we've ever recorded
Mm.
this past summer. And I do,
2022.
yeah, and I do believe several other states did as well. I haven't
Mhm.
heard that for sure, but there was a good
It's been
hatch.
it's been
Yeah.
consistent with
Which
the
is
ones I've
which is
talked to.
great. And a lot of states are going to say it's because they pushed their season back. Well, we can say we didn't, and we we saw it too. So
Yeah.
again, going back to Will's point, probably some regional thing, probably density independent. Probably some weather factor, something like that. So I would say to your question, the decline in the pulse per hen over time is interesting, right? I have not seen any empirical evidence to suggest it has to do with shooting gobblers too early because we don't actually see the resulting changes in demographics from that, right? So if you assume that's the case, you'd assume okay, then you would have less hens getting bred. Well, we haven't really seen a decline in percent of hens nesting. If you then you would see declines in nest success. Well, we have seen declines in nest success in some areas, but across the board, we just did a huge lit review. We're not seeing a decline in net success. There's not enough estimates, in my opinion, on brood survival. But I would say to your question, if that metric is very interesting to me, the fact that it is shown a downward trend generally across the region. All right, so then that makes me question, okay, what makes a pulse per hen there not be more pulse per hen? It's either there's an issue with nest success, which I don't see a lot of evidence for in the literature. Some regional areas, but not across the range.
At least not changes in it, you mean?
Not a steady decline in it. Like so,
Okay.
we've got a paper coming out. It's a massive lit review, and we've pulled every nest success estimate we can find in the literature since as early as they've been reported, and we're just not seeing that. Now, I'm not saying it's not occurring on some areas. I think it probably is, but we're not seeing this kind of ubiquitous trend like you're seeing with pulse per hen. Because if you're seeing that metric, something's got to lead to that, right?
Right.
So if it's not issues of fecundity, doesn't seem to be, then that begs the question: all right, how else can you get less pulse per hen? Well, it looks like something's either the pulse are dying or they're getting eaten or both. Can't think. So I would suggest the next, and there's been some research on this. I know Coulter Chitwood's I think they're doing one looking at broods. Chamberlain and Collier have done. They're starting to do a lot of brood work.
Tennessee's doing.
Yeah, there's a bunch of people doing brood work. I think we probably need to look. My guess is just based on properties that I'm on around the Southeast, I don't think there's a lot of quality nesting cover for turkeys. And I know, I know on WMAs we're not seeing a lot of turkeys. It doesn't take 10 minutes of driving around to think, where in the hell would a turkey nest out here?
Yeah.
So I think
I'm even more commonly like, well, where would they take their brood if they did?
Well, that's what I mean. Broods. I'm sorry. I said,
yeah.
Where are they going to brood? And where are chicks going to at least forage and survive? And so I think part of what we're seeing, I think it's reasonable to suggest we need to focus a little more on that, which several people are. But I think it has more to do than just tagging a bunch of chicks and following them around and getting survival estimates. I think we need that because it helps inform population models like we're building. But again, it goes back to experimentation. I'd love to go create some turkey brood habitat and on some areas and not others, and go catch a bunch of broods like we catch quail chicks and go throw them out there and see what they do.
Yeah, we actually, when we had Adam recently on it, I think we got onto this topic in the episode, but we all talked about that all of us like that's like a dream for me, is to have this large scale manipulative across many states. When we were talking to Adam about that, he's like, let me know about that, because maybe we can get all of y'all together and we can kind of make them coincide so that we can all collaborate on a larger regional.
It's like the study Will and y'all did with the pine thinning and stuff. Y'all had Alabama, Georgia. Y'all have another state? I can't remember.
It was Alabama and Georgia. Yeah.
Even then, that's more than most people have done, to combine that. And that was some cool stuff. Yeah. So I think where hens are going to take those broods and the outcome of that, I think is probably something we need to look at. We'd also just need more estimates of brood survival, and we typically do like to the 28-day thing. And with quail, we used to do it to 21 days, right? Well, James Martin then published a paper. I think it was him and I think it was Brad Kubechka, maybe some other folks. What they showed with tall timbers data was, because they have fancy little radios they put on those chicks now, And like that 21-day thing really wasn't a really good indicator of if that brood really succeeded or not. It was, we'd go and we'd flush them at 21 days and you count them and you compare that to how many chicks, how many eggs hatch, and you kind of infer from there what survival was. They showed that it really wasn't a really robust estimate. And so a lot of the things we've just done conventionally probably need to be revisited with the advanced technology. But yeah, I think that it's tough for a brood to make it. Now that brings to a question: what's the management solution to that? Right? Well, I would argue I'm a habitat guy. It's a habitat issue. Somebody else could probably just as easily argue it's a predator issue. And I really have no opposition to predator management when there's evidence to suggest that it's worth there's a positive ROI on it, right? And that's been the challenge with a lot of predator work over the years is the ROI is often disproportionately not something private landowners can get into. Not always, but that's generally the argument that's made. So yeah, I think this is hard for they're a galliform, they're more R selected, so they're probably going to be more impacted by reproductive measures. I think we're Dana Moore has done some really fascinating modeling for us with the litter review data we did. She built a population model. We're generally seeing evidence to support that, that recruitment measurement, right? Getting chicks from when they hatch to the next population, that variable is probably what's driving a lot, which is what evolutionary theory would suggest for a turkey anyway. Most of the sensitivity analysis that have been published, Pollinger's paper in 2017, demonstrated that very clearly. It was Lambda was most influenced by those type of parameters. So if we know the population sensitivity analysis tell us it's probably something having to do with chick survival, getting recruitment and parameters in general, and we're seeing this decline in poults per hen, and we're not seeing really large scale declines. Like there's no other parameter that we collect on turkeys in the literature, in my opinion, that is showing the ubiquitous pattern that poults per hen ratio, right? So that's interesting. And you couple that with what we know about their population ecology, then yeah, I'd say if we want to move the needle a little bit, we probably need to put some trees on the ground and light some fires at scales that are meaningful and create some more cover for broods. But here's another question on that. So I got into this a little bit in Georgia when I was doing extension work. So if you ask, I don't know how many turkey biologists there are in the country, let's say there's 100. You ask 100 of them to describe just with words, to describe turkey brood habitat, I think you'll be pretty shocked how variable it is. Now, if the turkey biologists can't agree on it, that's a challenge. We found this out with quail. They did a survey looking at kind of what relationship we see between abundance and certain parameters, percent forbs, all this stuff. And it was all over the place for the most part, but amongst really experienced biologists, it was a fairly, really good pattern. And that brought into the question, okay, can we even agree on what quail habitat is, right? So with turkeys, they're a little more challenging because they roost in trees and all this other stuff. But, defining what is good turkey brood cover, I said habitat again, Craig Harper's going to kill me. Defining what is good brood cover is
just so you know, every time one of y'all says that, it makes me cringe because I'm working with Craig for so long. I think about my experience as a master's student up there.
He lives rent free in all our heads.
Man, yeah. He called me out we were doing a webinar for like woodlands, I don't know what it was. It was something left over from Georgia, and I was doing it when I got to state, and it was me, him, and Bronson backed out at the last minute. So he and I were just cussing Bronson like crazy, and then I had to do Bronson's talk, and Craig had to do part of it. Anyway, we get into it, and I said something, we used habitat wrong, and Craig corrected me with 500 people online. And I was like, all right, I can't let this happen again. So I'm trying to train myself not to say
it. He got his he has accomplished what he was trying to.
He is definitely.
So, speaking of Craig, my definition and vision of what poult rearing cover looks like has been very heavily, if not exclusively, influenced by his teachings. And I commonly, have this, it's not like a cookie cutter type of thing, but I have a general thing that I have in my mind, and then I commonly end up on people's property and then try to describe that to them. And the problem that I find is that they respond with, "Can you show me that so that I can get a mental image of what that looks like?" And then I'm like, most of the time, no, because you don't have any.
Yeah.
You know,
You got to
like
take a
it's not
drive.
here, which is kind of that point that you're making. Uh, yeah, I have said that on the air. I don't know how many times now, and I'm sure people are tired of me talking about it, but I see that as a really big problem too. What I wanted to kind of lead into is a follow up to what Will's question was, and I didn't want to interrupt you. She had some great thoughts to you were navigating through, and I didn't want to interrupt it. But I just started wondering, okay, if we wanted to test density dependence, maybe not, maybe we can't do it range wide or whatever, but what data, what would we expect? Like, what would you be looking at? What metric? And then what would the relationship sort of look like if it was consistent with density dependence? Because
Yeah.
I feel like I'm still there.
Yeah. So there's a couple of levels to that. So if you just want to test and there's a bunch of people back in the late 90s, Dennis and Tapper's paper in 94, and they had another paper in 2001, I think. Their argument was we need to quit testing for density dependence. It's there, right? We need to just go to mechanistic approaches, right? I think it was their paper. And I disagree with that because the burden of proof is sometimes necessary to convince people this is worthy of study, right? So if we just wanted to test it, just quantify the metric and perhaps in addition the strength and magnitude, or the magnitude and direction and the shape of it, I guess. If you had long-term abundance data and you could kind of look at that, right? You could look at, and you had estimates of density each year, and you could estimate the growth rate, and you could plot that. And if you see a negative slope, bam. Now the strength of that slope is really important because it determines kind of how impactful that density dependent feedback is going to be. That's the easiest way to test, just to see if it's there, right? And because we know density dependence is, or not know, evidence seems to suggest, I hate saying no, I don't know anything, right? I just generally understand what the literature tells me, is that it's nonlinear from McGee's work, which was really robust. That I think he used, not that your audience is probably going to care much, but the theta logistic model, and it gives you the ability to model nonlinear density dependence in a really cool way. That'd be the easiest, and you can do it with any time series data, right? That'd be the first thing. I'd say, let's just do that, since people don't yet seem to be convinced on this, although I think the Byrne paper was really indicative. But let's say we had really good abundance data on a large but very finite scale that we could really process this. All right, that's step one. Step two, then, all right, let's figure out what it means, right? What's the mechanism? Because that's really what's going to affect management, right? Density dependence itself doesn't really change how we manage. It just helps us understand population performance a little bit differently, right? So then I would say, let's figure out the mechanism. Now that is a can of worms because we don't know how it manifests, right? We think from the Byrne paper, it manifests probably that it's density dependent reproduction, right? But it can also be density dependent survival, right? And it can manifest one way or both ways, right? There's some populations that typically have a stronger, it can't be the same on each one though, right? So it's going to either be stronger on one and weaker on the other because the population's got to be able to compensate somehow to respond to that decline. So I don't know if it's density dependent survival, but I assume I think it's good evidence to suggest we should probably try the density dependent recruitment, right? So now we go and we try to figure out, we try to invoke it, right? And that's the fun part. So let's say you had long-term data on turkeys, you had a bunch of fancy GPS units, and you were just monitoring every metric you could get. A couple ways you could do it. You could go in and say, okay, I think food is limiting. Let me just saturate this place with food. And if you see recruitment go up and you have a control to compare it to, right, or hopefully more than one control, right, this is where the experiment comes in, that would give you necessary and sufficient causation to suggest perhaps that food was limiting, right? So now we have a mechanism, right? We managed to increase food. How we do that, that's another debate. But if you think but that's if it increases recruitment. What if you go in and you supplement food and it increases survival, right? So you essentially have to design experiments where you have to go in and you got to really screw with these turkeys. You got to go in and the other way would be, okay, let's go in, let's shoot the hell out of these turkeys or just take them out and move them somewhere else. But shooting's more fun. You hire you two guys to go in as sharpshooters and you just start whacking and stacking hens, right? And then you see if the remaining hens actually have a positive response, like their fecundity is higher or their nest success is higher, right? All right, well, that's density dependence too, because you're seeing a response in reproduction or nest success from a reduction in abundance. right? So you could do all these types of manipulative experiments that no one would probably, pay for, because this is not easy to do, but they help you understand what the actual mechanism is. How is density dependence actually manifesting itself? Because it's happening somewhere, right? We just don't know which it is, nor do we know which one is stronger. And I think you'll find in the literature would support this in other species. Going to Will's point earlier, it may be stronger impact on survival in one part of the range and a stronger impact on reproduction in the other part of the range, right? That's really interesting to know, because we rarely get to manage something the same across its range, especially something like, eastern wild turkeys, which I don't know how many states they're in, but it's a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So
Well,
those are some cool experiments you could do.
Yeah, that's really cool stuff. And I guess the other thing that is hard for me to wrap my head around, and it seems like it for a lot of people, because we always throw out, even as examples, the same limiting factors. Like it's got to be food or predators or a handful of things, and then it's like, well, wait, what if it's not?
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
we don't even know what all the limiting factors are that could be operating, like you were talking about earlier with the quail. That's in a landscape where all of the things that we think are limiting are no longer, they're going through extraordinary efforts to make sure they are not.
Yeah.
And there's still this density dependent relationship, which maybe is related to any suite of factors.
Yeah, you can't get away from it, but it raises, what they've done is they've raised the threshold at which it kicks in.
So they can carry more birds, but you're still seeing density dependent patterns in the population dynamics.
You cannot get rid of it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's consistent with what Adam was saying when he was talking about the population. So they sort of, have these little boom bust cycles and over a few year period. And
we're definitely seeing that in some of their data. It's really cool.
Yeah. Well, and that's suggestive of this process, just that pattern itself. But even if we go and make everything brooding cover and everything high quality food and reduce all the predators, it doesn't like take that out, where that pattern. It just changes what population level the bouncing around is.
That's right. It changes the ebbs and the flows, right? So at Tall Timbers, what they showed was, and you can look at in my dissertation, it shows this. They had these pretty big swings, over time. And once they started supplemental feeding, because they weren't doing predator management at this time. Once they started supplemental feeding, you didn't take away the ebbs and flows. You took away the troughs, right? So in bad years, the bad years were less bad, right?
Yeah.
But on good years,
sort of like narrowed.
Yeah, you're reducing that variability by making a more predictable, stable environment, right? And
that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what gets really interesting with that is the density dependent factors. It's like you said, Mark. You've said repeatedly, as you take one away, another one potentially just pops up in its place. And we've even seen in like mouse model systems where they have unlimited food and all kind of resources that they need, but then just like from density stress, like you start to get these like behavioral factors that influence in, and it may be even like at the pheromones causing hormone cascades and influencing reproduction and things like that. Things can get really squirrely at that point.
Yeah, stress hormones, cortisol, all kinds of stuff. And a lot of people that don't like the density dependent argument, they see it as, it's very interesting to me. They see it as somehow contrasting with habitat management, which baffles me. It's like, well, if we just increase habitat, we'll get more brood cover or something. We'll get more chicks. So that means it's a habitat issue. Well, yeah, but what does habitat provide, right? Like something's still limiting, and it's some density, it can't sustain it, right? So density dependence, this is where I really like how we've tried to focus on the mechanism part, because density dependence is just something you quantify and understand, okay? And we need to understand it. And we need to quantify it so we can know what role it's playing, especially relative to density independent factors, right? But the real meat and potatoes of what we do as wildlife managers that's just like step one. Let's quantify it. Now let's figure out what we do about it, because what we're generally trying to do is right now, let's say turkeys are operating, let's just say we're correct, and they're operating at just a reduced carrying capacity than 20 years ago. Okay, well, how do we raise carrying capacity, right? Well, hopefully that's through habitat manipulation, right? So and what does that do? That provides hopefully more food and cover, and then we see a population respond. That doesn't mean density dependence wasn't operating. It just means we have to understand its role so we can try to augment it. That's all wildlife management is for game species. You're trying to make something limiting less limiting so the population can grow at a rate or at a magnitude that is more conducive to your goals. So if turkey hunters want more turkeys and we're just the landscape's less conducive, the management recommendation doesn't change here. I think we just got used to what we were doing, which really wasn't turkey centric for a long time. We just got used to the fact that we're still riding this turkey wave, and now the wave is kind of receded, and it's like, oh, like we were doing this. Well, okay, that wave's over. We got to do more now. And I think if we do more, we'll probably see at a meaningful scale, we'll probably see turkey populations respond in a positive way. I don't see any reason they wouldn't, unless there's some other issue like disease or something that we're not accounting for. And that's a whole nother debate. But there could be things that we just haven't looked at yet that we need to look at.
Yeah, really interesting stuff.
Yeah, galliforms are awesome, man.
Yeah, no, I see the appeal. So we've been going on and on about this, and I know we could probably sit here for another several hours, but we don't have that time. None of us do. And our listeners probably don't either. So.
They could be on long road trips. You don't know.
Yeah. Maybe so. I hope they're on the way to somewhere good. So we normally, when we're trying to, wrap things up, we wanted to give you an opportunity to let us know are there any take-home messages or things that you failed to say that you would like to say or reiterate if you've already said.
I think at the end of the day, just reminding, are most of y'all's listeners, I assume they're just turkey hunters and maybe some researchers or biologists, or do we know?
Yeah, I think we have a mix, probably dominated by the hunting community.
Yeah. So the hunting community, my message to them is, I assume they all care about this bird and I have no reason to think otherwise. The more you can learn about turkey population dynamics and turkey habitat management, being informed to the highest degree is just the best thing in the world. And if you have the ability to manipulate land to benefit turkeys, please do so. Regarding what we're talking about today, just know that, a lot of big population dynamics terms here. Just understand that density dependence is something that most populations we've documented in. The populations we haven't in, it's often because we haven't asked or we don't have the data to support it. With turkeys, there's probably going to be a fair amount of debate regarding how important this topic is over the next several years. And my advice is just listen to everybody's opinion and, go where the evidence takes you. And the good thing is scientists are having these conversations and debates. I often tell my wife, without disagreement, you don't have discovery. And that is,
part of it's just challenging each other to, make sure we're shored up on our.
Yep. And like I said, it doesn't bother me for somebody to say, that guy's full of it, right? Bring it on. Let's have a conversation. The data is going to be what's going to end up making the thing. And if you're a hunter and you care about turkey research, join the Federation, join all the different NGOs that are out there, help them. They're supporting a lot of our research. They're really trying to help manage this resource that we all love and support your state agency and be patient with them. They're in
a really difficult situation.
They're in a really difficult situation. We're all trying to make the best of it and try to make good decisions. Just be patient. And and just like I said, help support science leading the way we manage these birds. And if you can do that, I think at the end of the day, that's the safest approach to ensure we have this resource for as long as we can enjoy it.
That's awesome.
Yeah, great stuff. Well, I know you've got plenty to do and you're on the road, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. It was really, really cool stuff and things that I don't think of in the depth that I should often. So really appreciate that. Yeah. So, and again, we'd love to have you back on. I know you've got work in progress in Mississippi, and we really want to keep up with you on what you're doing
Yeah, we got a cool project in South in Itchaway, I think, with fire and bobwhites. I think you'll get a kick out of Marcus. I have a student. He just finished his first season. He'll deploy in January for a second one, but trying to look at how they respond to fire immediately after, and how long it takes them to kind of reuse a burned area at the rate maybe they were using it before. So
Yeah.
cool stuff that's right up your alley.
Oh yeah. Well, I had a class where we were burning as part of the class, and we will sit up on the hill. It's at Tall Timbers and watch the burned area while we kind of hang out after class is over in the evening, and
Yeah.
we'll have them pitching in there into the burned area. So I'd be
Oh, yeah.
really curious to see how that
Yeah.
compares. Like anecdotally, just from that, it's like, wow.
Well, so I was telling the student, I was like, well, we've all seen Quail do it. I was like, but I was like, Marcus has really got people talking about, like turkeys especially, but anything kind of coming in after the fried grasshopper thing. And I was like, I really like to know how predictable that is, and kind of the magnitude, or how far they go in. So he's looking at distance to the cover.
Oh, that'll be good stuff.
Yeah, we're trying a bunch of stuff with that. But did you by any chance video Quail going in after when you're up on the hill doing that?
No, we haven't videoed it in that case, and we haven't captured it on trail camera with Quail, but
well, it's hard to capture on trail camera, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. We've got actually we've developed a couple of ways that we're doing that a little better, but yeah, I have noticed that Quail they are definitely flying, and they're always flying in when we see them. But on multiple occasions now, we've documented that while we were just sitting there watching the burn unit we've just burned. So kind of cool.
Yeah, we're kind of curious. Like, all right, so if they're doing that, how long are they staying in there? And then, which we're not really getting at that because we don't have the manpower to do that kind of telemetry. But kind of how popular is that behavior? And then how far from the edge are they going? And how does that distance to the edge change as it revegetates? Right. And
yeah. Well, and another just interesting anecdote that maybe you may already be thinking about, or it may help you think about it. One thing that seems to be pretty obvious from this anecdote is they kind of fly in there to a patch of vegetation that still has structure, and then anchor to that, and you can actually see them coming out and eating. In
interesting.
The unit.
So of course they're doing mostly backfires at this spot, and they do some head fires, but it's a fairly slow, good fire. And the student was like, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that didn't actually consume. I was like, yeah. Map that. Like that's going to be important. Like let's quantify that.
I bet they anchor to it for sure.
That'd be cool. Yeah. And then Mike Connor put some cameras out to look at how mesomammals respond. So it's going to be fun stuff over there.
Yeah. Cool. Sounds like fun stuff.
Yep. Well, thanks guys. I thoroughly enjoyed it and appreciate the opportunity, and hopefully see y'all at the next conference.
Yeah. Well, we really appreciate it.
Appreciate it, Mark. Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.